Hello, my name is Professor Bill Ledger. I'm Emeritus Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at University of New South Wales, and it's my pleasure and privilege to host today Professor John Aitken on this podcast. To introduce John, he's Distinguished Emeritus Laureate Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Newcastle, and he's also Scientific Director of Memphasis Limited, which is a biotech company based in Sydney. And our topic is about the decline in fertility, both nationally and globally, why this might be happening and what might be done about it. And John, just to produce an opening question for you, the background to this, people always quote TFR, and governments and politicians make a lot of this statistic. Maybe you could begin by just talking about the statistics that are relevant to national and global population and how we should interpret them.
Yes, Bill, well, thank you for that question. And it's much more difficult to assess fertility than you might imagine. So traditionally, fertility is an output measure, and it measures the average number of children a woman will have in her reproductive life. And the World Health Organization defines a reproductive life as basically 15 years old to 49. So there are two ways of measuring fertility. One is the so-called cohort measure, which means that we actually do gather data on the average number of children a woman had in her reproductive life. The problem with that measure is that the latest date on which we could make that assessment in 2025 is 1975, because women have to have completed their reproductive lifespan for you to make the assessment, right?
Yep.
So it's called completed family size. It's a retrospective measure. It's very robust and it's real data. The assessment criterion that you mentioned, which is TFR or Total Fertility Rate, isn't actually real data. What it is a theoretical projection. And what it assumes is that a woman will have the age-specific fertility rates that are prevalent in the year that you're doing the analysis. So a woman may only be 20 years old in 2025, but it assumes that she will have the fertility rates of each age group as she goes through her reproductive life that are prevalent this year. So it's a very sensitive measure. It can be troubled by a variety of different things, so it can mislead you. But I think the overall and important conclusion is that the cohort measure, completed fertility rate, and the period measure, total fertility rate, are all giving us the same message. And that message is that all over the world, fertility is in decline. And just before I leave that topic, because it really is a fascinating one, I want to distinguish between fertility and fecundity.
Yeah.
Fecundity is your capacity to have children. That's a biological measure. And it's very difficult to assess. Probably the most robust assessment we have now is time to pregnancy. And we don't often design studies to collect that kind of information. So I think it's important for people to realize that fertility is a matter of your personal choices and a variety of other things, but your fecundity is your fundamental capacity to have children. And whether that is shifting with time is one of the major unanswered questions in our field, I think.
Well, I think that defines the problem very, very clearly. I guess the obvious follow-on question, John, you allude to this. Why do you think that birth rate is falling, as you mentioned, globally?
Yeah, well, it's due to a complex mixture of factors, but essentially it's related to the modernization of society. So societies become modernized. They acquire the knowledge, they acquire the resources and the prosperity to be able to improve their primary healthcare measures. And one of the first consequences of that is a reduction in infant mortality. And you see that across the board in every society as they engage modernization, infant mortality rates fall. And that immediately has a knock-on effect in terms of fertility, because if parents are confident that all their children are going to survive, they don't have so many children. Our species kind of evolved at a time when the average family size was 6 or 7, because at least half of those children were going to die in infancy or early childhood. And more or less death rates and birth rates were balanced, and our species didn't go anywhere until the late 1800s. And then suddenly infant mortality rates declined, and immediately there was a response in terms of population growth. But then as we've gone on, that rate of population growth has declined. And why is that? Well, because I think when infant mortality rates decline and family sizes become smaller, you give to women one of the most important gifts of all, which is time. And they have used that time to become educated and develop professional careers. And one of the inadvertent consequences of that is that the age at which families are starting, women are starting their families, is now being pushed out into at least 30 years or more. And we will, in a later question, we'll come to this, I know, but I think that is one of the limiting factors on families. The other thing that happens to our species over time is we become more urbanized, and in urban environments are not conducive to high fertility. For one thing, it costs a lot of money to accommodate and educate children in an urban environment. In urban environments, there are even more opportunities for women to get paid labor and join the workforce. Fertility regulating measures, contraceptives, are more freely available. And I think in the background of all of this is a kind of rather philosophical point, which is that the modernization of society, which is not just about prosperity, it's also about equality and autonomy, has led to a change in life's purpose. I don't think we necessarily see life's purpose anymore as procreation. I think for many people, the purpose of life is a journey to self-realization and fulfillment of potential. And I think that's another reason why fertility rates are declining.
Which highlights to me the paradox, which is that maybe in many years to come, the latter part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st will be remembered as the era in which women became emancipated and were able to compete and perform equally in many fields with men for the first time. And the corollary to that is that having children early impedes that ability to compete on an equal playing field. And maybe that's been one of the fundamental reasons that we're seeing this change now.
I think it's a very, very powerful driver to the decline in fertility that we are seeing. There are many more, and for all we know, another factor might be a change in fecundity. The number of women that now are going to infertility clinics to have their children is increasing very rapidly. And I know we'll come to this later on, but it's one of the signals that something is happening fundamentally to our fecundity. Declining sperm counts would be another signal that something's happening to our fecundity. So, as I said in the answer to your first question, I think this is still one of the great unanswered mysteries in our field as to whether the change in fertility is being accompanied by a change in fecundity.
Yeah. Which leads on to maybe the next point, because we generally are keen to give warning to women who age about the decline in egg quality and fertility, but we must remember the male, and your own work has shown that the evidence for a decline in male fecundity is maybe even more clear-cut than for women, although it occurs at a later age. Maybe we should talk about that for a little while.
Yeah, so I think that the impact of age on human reproduction, male and female, is incredibly profound. We're a very unusual species in that we stop reproducing in midlife. There are very few other species that do that. And it places limits on, just how far you can push our biology. And, there's one thing, we can change many things about society, but the one thing we cannot change is our fundamental biology. And in females of our species, there is a precipitous loss of fertility between the ages of about 35 and the early 40s. And by delaying childbirth, we are pushing women into that zone where time-dependent, age-dependent infertility is becoming a major factor. And as we've rehearsed, that is one of the reasons why fertility rates are falling. But what about the male? Well, as males age, they too see a fall in their fertility, but it's not as precipitous as we see in their female counterparts. So men can reproduce into late age. Indeed, I think the world record is held by an Indian gentleman who had his last child when he was 96. So men can reproduce into late age. But the interesting thing about men as they age is their fertility declines a little bit, but what declines much more is the quality of their spermatozoa and their ability to support normal embryonic development. So as men age, you see an increase in the risk of miscarriage in their female partners if they become pregnant. And as males age, you see an increase in morbidity in their offspring. And particularly dominant genetic diseases like Apert syndrome and achondroplasia, but also a wide range of neuropsychiatric disorders like autism and spontaneous schizophrenia, all have very powerful correlations with paternal age at the time of conception. So yeah, age is definitely the enemy of human fertility.
Well, let's take that to a political level now, because thankfully neither you nor I are in charge of the decisions about running a country, but if we were, I think we might be worried about the decline in the number of young people and the alteration in the balance between young and old. We see this in the press every day. Maybe could you just run through what options you think government may have in order to encourage women and couples to maybe start their family earlier in order to avoid the problems you've alluded to?
Yes, no, that's a very interesting question. So fundamentally, do pronatalist policies work is the question. And whenever you talk about the interference of governments in human fertility, the first country that springs to mind is always China, which had the one-child family policy when they thought that fertility rates were too high, and then the two-child family policy and the three-child family policy when they thought that fertility rates were too low. In fact, none of these governmental edicts had any impact at all on the population patterns in China. They were falling well before the one-child family policy was introduced, and they continued to fall when the second and third child family policies were introduced. Governmental policies can have some impact on human fertility. It is true, and I'll give you some examples. But the forces that are driving down human fertility are much more powerful than the counter forces coming from government trying to encourage you to have your families earlier. So the kind of policies that have worked, I think, are the ones that we see in Scandinavia, where there is, I think, good provision for young couples to have children earlier. You see a variety of different measures, tax credits for having families, baby bonuses. In Australia, we know all about baby bonuses. Parental leave schemes, all those kind of things, I think, are helpful and encourage young couples to have children. And they are certainly a positive element, but they cannot turn the tide. So I think governments are relatively powerless when it comes to controlling the fertility of its populations. These are decisions that are made by the people for very personal reasons, and what the government thinks is very low on their list of priorities.
There was a nice article in the London Times. It was UK Mother's Day last week, and Jenny Russell, who's one of their more intelligent contributors, wrote an article about this topic, and she mentioned a YouGov survey that showed that the parents who are living in those societies where they have financial support and tax credits and so forth felt a lot happier, but they actually didn't have more children.
Yes, that's exactly how it is. We make our decisions about having children for very personal reasons, and the will of the government's not a high priority for us.
So I think what we're hearing from your analysis is this is a complex socio-political problem, and yes, there may be a decline in fecundity, but this is not particularly seen, I think, as a medical problem itself. So do you think there is a role for IVF, which is a treatment for medical infertility? Can it be used significantly to reduce decline in total fertility rate?
I think this is all very much a question of scale. So if IVF's an amazing technology. It has brought happiness to millions of people. It's a very positive thing. And when IVF was a kind of cottage industry responsible for less than 1% of the newborn babies, there were nothing but positive things about it. It, as I said, brought joy to those who couldn't otherwise conceive. But now we're looking at a situation where in many countries, more than 5%, Australia, I think 5.7% of newborns are conceived by ART. Some countries it's 10%. And in all countries, the vector is upwards. And we have to kind of think about this, because if we start to conduct IVF at scale and 20, 30% of your population are being conceived in this way, there are certainly implications for health service providers and for governments. But there are also implications there for biology. As we go forward, we may be creating a new problem, because in as much as infertility has a genetic origin, and it's very difficult to know, Bill, but people have put a figure of 50% on that. So 50% of all human infertility is genetic. And if you are using IVF for maybe 30% of your population, which is where the current sort of trajectory is carrying us, then what you do every time you perform IVF is you encourage these poor fertility genes to remain within the population. And something I have said many times is that the more you use IVF, the more you're going to need it. This is good for the industry, but it's not so good for governments. And my plea is that we think more carefully about this and don't use IVF as a default treatment for every case of human infertility, male and female. We'd be much better off if we spend a bit of time thinking very carefully about the etiology and discovering what the actual pathologies are, and develop treatments that either prevent or are tailor-made for particular pathologies, rather than just reverting to IVF all the time. But I repeat, when it's conducted at low scale, it's just the most wonderful thing in the world. But when it's conducted at scale, and large percentages of your population are produced with this technology, there may be repercussions, and a bad situation will just be made worse.
Yeah. So taking you back to the role of a politician in charge of policy for a major industrialized country, do you think government should be making financial contribution to support women and men going through IVF to make it cheaper and more accessible from the demographic perspective? Or does your argument about the decline in quality of the gene pool apply at that level?
Yeah, I think there are different forces at play at the level of the individual and the level of government. So at an individual level, I think, as you've already pointed out, so in Scandinavia, there is good governmental support for IVF, and it is a widely adopted technique. And it doesn't actually necessarily increase population numbers, but it certainly facilitates the use of this as a way of helping young couples have children. And even in Australia, we have rebate schemes that certainly assist. Yeah. But I don't think any of us wants to live in a society where only the rich can reproduce. That goes against everything. Modern society is characterized by autonomy, freedom, and equality. And that applies to our reproductive lives as well as our lives outside of reproduction. So I think these are very helpful measures, and in the short term, they certainly will be very positive for young couples wanting to have children. But in the longer term, we want to try to keep the use of this technology to a sensible level, so it doesn't run away from us.
No, and it does seem to be, I agree with you that these days the IVF technology seems to be seen as a solution to all forms of fertility problems. And that goes against the grain. It's useful technology, but no, we should be doing more to look at cause and find specific treatments, less costly, less environmentally costly, John, also, because the environmental impact of IVF on a big scale is disastrous.
Yeah, and you can see this very well in sort of my own area of interest, which is male infertility, which is universally treated by IVF without any knowledge at all of the etiology of the condition. And in fact, ICSI rather, was what was it? Video killed the radio star. It was the new technology that meant that andrology was no longer of interest to people because we can solve the problem. Why do we need to know why the problem was created? But if we knew more about the etiology, we might be able to circumvent the use of IVF.
Yes, and
A hammer to hit every nail.
Yeah. So before asking you to summarize, one further question which I've spoken about before, that is this really a bad thing? Because the data on global warming are overwhelming. The impact it will have on our children and our children's children will be disastrous. And however lean and mean people try to be, every human being generates CO2. And the world population is heading towards maybe 10 billion within our lifetime, let alone the young people. Shouldn't we maybe be encouraging the population of the globe in a civilized way over time to reduce, rather than having global pandemics and war and other conflicts that are a desperately bad way to reduce the population size?
Yeah. So you make a very sound point. So the world is overpopulated. If you plot CO2 emissions in the atmosphere against population numbers, there's a linear correlation there. The density of people on the planet is certainly causing us a problem. But I think we should try to avoid looking at fertility as a good or a bad thing. Because on the one hand, yes, overpopulation has consequences for the planet that we should realize. But also what is happening to our species has, in terms of its fertility, has negative connotations as well. I don't think we've really grasped the geopolitical consequences of the population of China halving before the end of the century. We haven't really grasped that. And there are a number of countries now where the fall of fertility is going to have an existential impact. To take one example, Bulgaria. So in Bulgaria, birth rates are low, death rates are high, fertility rates are low, emigration is high, and the combination of that, all those factors, is bringing that particular country to the verge of demographic collapse. And that's just one country. And as we go forward, that's going to overwhelm more and more countries. We're kind of buffered against that in Australia because people want to come here. We have high rates of immigration that enable us to paper over the cracks of our endemic infertility. But, my plea is that we try to understand the factors that are driving fertility in one direction or the other, and try to become managers of our demographic fate and not its hapless victims. Let's try to get hold of this and manage it. And otherwise, we will just be hapless victims. The World Health Organization at one point, in fact, the United Nations at one point said, well, all populations will decline to replacement level and then they'll stabilize.
Yeah.
That was total nonsense. That the forces that are driving down fertility are not going to relent. They're going to keep on driving down fertility. And there gets to a point where, as I say, some countries will face an existential crisis.
To the article at the time,
we do need to manage it rather than just let it happen.
It did show that 91% of parents were pleased that they were parents and that they had decided to have children. And maybe in the future, we need to emphasize the positives about being a parent, male or female parent or other gender parent, rather than this current negativity about cost and the impact on your life as a holistic thing. And, maybe it's about education and persuasion rather than government using blunderbuss tactics that, as you've so nicely shown, don't really work.
Yeah, no, I go back to a point I made earlier. I think we have to understand what is happening to us and try to. There are many things we cannot change in life, and we cannot change our biology. So society needs to change in order to accommodate our biology, not try to use IVF to force our biology to accommodate our social needs. It needs to be the other way around. And although we all welcome equality and the entry of women into the workforce, I don't think society has really adjusted in a structural way to accommodate that and allow it to happen. There should be no reason at all why a woman can't engage in a professional career and not have her capacity to have children compromised. It just needs a restructuring of the way that society is run in order to accommodate that. So again, I think we just need to wake up to what is happening to us and take control of it rather than just become the victims of the systems that are currently in place.
John, I think that's a lovely point at which to stop, because you very nicely summarized our conversation over the past few minutes. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this podcast for Aspire. I hope it generates interest. I'm sure you'd be more than happy to communicate with people who would like to go further with this. And I hope this is of interest to our listeners. Thank you.
And thank you, Bill. That was a great pleasure.